Fellows again with Other People's Pockets on the first and third Wednesday of the month. I'm Cat here starting at 8 o'clock. We just kind of snuck in here. It's a nice December day, nice and warm out there. Well, warm is all relative, I would imagine. When you talk about that, yeah, we've had a lot of things we can talk about, including the bailout of the big three. This Friday, December 5th, happens to be the 75th anniversary of the repeal day. This is lessons on prohibition, and it talks about repeal day drives home the folly of the drug war, which most people would understand that the drug war is nothing more an excuse to seize assets, to ban guns and that kind of stuff. And so it's not getting after the bad guys, but it's getting after you and I and the daily things that we do and that kind of stuff. But this is dated to byline December 3rd, 2008. And it talks about this Friday, of course, is December 5th, the 75th anniversary of Repeal Day, the day America repealed this disastrous alcohol prohibition. Excuse me. We know that nobody really wanted it. You know, alcohol still flourished during those time frames, and Al Capone made a lot of money based on alcohol. It goes on to say prohibition was a Paris de Resisti of the early 20th century progressives' grand social engineering agenda. It failed, of course, miserably, says Radley Balco. It did reduce overall consumption of alcohol in the U.S., but the consumption came largely among those who consumed alcohol responsibly. The actual harm caused by alcohol abuse was made worse thanks to the economics of prohibitions. Black market alcohol was of dubious origin, unregulated by market forces. The price premium that attaches to banned substances made the alcohol that made it to consumers more potent and more dangerous. And, of course, organized crime rose and flourished thanks to the new market created by the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. You know, and I've heard stories of the old Florence Hotel, way back when, down in the basement, you'd have to knock on the door, and they had one of those looking glass mirrors, see-through mirrors, and of course, if the bouncer didn't recognize you, you wouldn't get in. But Missoula had its places where you could go and get alcohol just like anybody else. It talks about hospitalizations related to alcohol soared, and so did violent crime. Corruption flourished as law enforcement officials in charge of enforcing prohibitions went on the take from beat cops all the way to the office of the United States Attorney General. Even the U.S. Senate had a secret illegal stash of booze for its members and their staffs. In 1924, the great social critic H.L. Mencken wrote of prohibition. He says, 5 years of prohibition have had at least this one benign effect. They have completely disposed of all the favorite arguments of the prohibitionists. None of the great boons and user facts that were to follow the passage of the 18th Amendment has come to pass. There is not less drunkenness in the Republic, but more. There is not less crime, but more, he writes. There is not less insanity, but more. The cost of government is not smaller, but vastly greater. Respect for law has not increased, but diminished. And we can see that in most any other cases out there where the United States government decides to ban something, and not only does it make it worse, it makes it worse. A bill in Congress celebrating the anniversary of Repeal Day echoes Mencken sentiments. It notes that throughout American history, alcohol has been consumed by its citizens, that prohibition resulted in abuses and the irresponsible overconsumption of alcohol, and that the ban on intoxicating liquors in the United States resulted in a dramatic increase in illegal activity, including unsafe black market alcohol production, organized crime, and noncompliance with alcohol laws. But there's one thing we can say, alcohol prohibition. At least it was constitutional. The prohibitionists built support for their cause by demonizing alcohol from state to state, winning over local legislators one at a time. When they'd built a significant national movement, they started the momentum for a constitutional amendment. Congress did not pass a blanket federal law. Constitution be damned. They understood that the federal government hasn't the authority to issue a national ban on booze, so they moved to enact the ban properly. When American When America repealed prohibition, we repealed it with a constitutional amendment making explicit that the power to regulate alcohol is reserved to the states. Even today, when Congress wants to pass federal alcohol laws, such as the federal drinking age or federal minimum blood alcohol standard for drunk driving, it can't simply dictate policy to the states. Instead, it ties the laws to federal highway funding, a blackmail that, while distasteful, at least carries a pretense of adherence to the Constitution. And we kind of hate that here in Montana, especially this next legislative session. They're going to work for another primary seatbelt law, and we're probably going to pass it based on the fact that we're going to get $6 million from the federal government tacked onto our highway funding if we pass it. So that's kind of hard to resist. Contrast that to drug prohibition, where Congress and the Supreme Court, when it upheld it, made no attempt to comply with the Constitution in passing the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, CSA, the law that gave us the modern drug war. And that was during the Nixon administration, and he was a Republican, no doubt. There's one question that drug prohibition has been every bit the failure alcohol prohibition was. Nearly 40 years after the CSA passed, we have 400,000 people in prison for nonviolent drug crimes, a domestic police force that often looks and acts like an occupying military force, and nearly $1 trillion spent on enforcement, both here and through aggressive eradication efforts overseas, in urban areas that can resemble war zones. Yet illicit drugs like cocaine and marijuana are as cheap and abundant as they were in 1970. The street price for both drugs has actually dropped dramatically since the government began keeping track in the early 1980s. The main difference between the two prohibitions is that one was enacted lawfully, and once it became clear that it had failed, we repealed it, and government revenues soared with new alcohol taxes. As the drug war has failed, the government merely claims more powers to fight it more aggressively. We mentioned, they want to ban certain handguns, seize property and the like just to get some more revenues. Elliot Ness and his colleagues raided supply lines, manufacturing hubs, and warehouses, but alcohol consumption was still legal. He didn't have armed to the teeth cops breaking down the doors of private homes the way they do for people suspected of consensual drug crimes. During Prohibition, doctors could prescribe alcohol as medication. Today, federal SWAT teams swarm medical marijuana clinics and terrorize their patients. Thanks to the Supreme Court's 2005 decision in Gonzalez versus Reich, which allowed the federal government to prevent a dying woman from possessing medical marijuana solely for her own use to treat the symptoms of her illness, even though the voters of California had determined that she should be left alone. We had aired some of that a few years back anyway, when she came to Missoula for a visit at the University of Montana. When he first visited the United States in 1921, Albert Einstein wrote of America's ban on booze, and he quotes, the prestige of government has undoubtedly been lowered considerably by the Prohibition law, for nothing is more destructive of respect for the government and the law of the land than passing laws which cannot be enforced. That is true today as it is then, he mentions. And this was by Bradley Balco, who was a senior editor. Reason is true. The more they try to stop it, the worse it tends to get. And I think it's probably true that in the 1970s, had we just legalized marijuana, we wouldn't have this problem with smaller, more potent drugs like crack, tar, whatever, heroin, and the other stuff that's being sold on the black market today. But over the past few months, we've talked about breakdowns and bailouts, and why not bail out me? I heard on the Jerry Doyle show a few weeks back that there was a certain date, I think it was November 12th or 14th, one of those during that time frame where you could just mail in a 2-page form and submit your own bailout to Congress. And had we known about that, we could have got a lot of people to fill in their forms and requested their money for economic bailout. But this is from Michael Flynn, and it talks about the autonomy of a breakdown. And of course, he talks about it is not an absence of federal intervention that produced the great financial panic of 2008, contrary to the assertions of those clamoring for new regulations. The liquidity shortage and the credit freeze that triggered Washington's biggest intrusion into the economy since Richard Nixon's wage and price controls were caused by bad government policy and worse crisis management. And for those who don't remember, it was the wage and price controls that essentially got the Libertarian Party together and organized and on the ballot to where we're on the ballot pretty much organized in all 50 states. And he says, as the housing bubble inflated from the 1997 to 2006, banks fueled by the Federal Reserve, prodded by activists and egged on by Wall Street, created ever more exotic mortgage loans that pushed up the housing prices and extended mortgage debt to families vulnerable to economic turndowns. Of course, those were families that were trying to buy more than they could afford. And of course, it was the legislative conference at the time that we wanted to give more people the opportunity to buy a house. And so we went into, I should say, the low-income neighborhoods that probably couldn't afford to buy a house at that time anyway, and we encouraged them to buy a house for more they can afford. And obviously, when they couldn't make the payments, well, we were going to have a lot of foreclosures. Several layers of financial products were tied to these mortgages, more or less bundles. As some of the derivative instruments and underlying mortgages collapsed, collateral damage raced through the entire system, which brought the entire system down. In 2008, the Bush administration took a series of frantic steps to stop the bleeding. It backed a hostile takeover of the investment bank, Bear Stearns. It took over home lending, BMO's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, an act that put $5 trillion worth of mortgages, more than $1 trillion of which are subprime, on the federal government's books. And not to mention, of course, the $200 billion it had committed to guarantee Fannie and Freddie's debts. It made hundreds of billions of dollars available to banks through Fed's discount window. Its mechanism to make short-term loans to certain institutions put up $85 billion to take over the insurance giant AIG, and offered another $250 billion to individual banks to rebuild their balance sheets. In October, the administration convinced Congress to authorize the Treasury's Department to spend upwards of $700 billion tying up toxic mortgage-backed securities, most of which contain sizable numbers of subprime mortgages. Each step not only failed to calm the market, but seemed to increase the sense of impending doom, which he says also fanned the sky is falling pronouncements from President Bush on down. After a month of U.S. government action, the mortgage crisis had grown into a global financial panic, the repercussions of which we'll be living with for decades. And of course, that $700 billion, guess who got to dole out some of that money? It was the underling that belonged to Goldman Sachs. And of course, the Treasury Secretary was also a Goldman Sachs alumni, so you can guess that most of that money was going to his friends and his cohorts in the financial market. He talks about the roots of the crisis. Throughout the 90s and the early days of the century, both major political parties became intoxicated with the idea of promoting affordable housing. By the time the crisis blew up, Congress was mandating that roughly 50% of the mortgages issued by Fannie and Freddie go to households making below their area's median income. Many conservative commentators have blamed the housing mess on the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, which essentially required banks to increase lending in low-income areas. While the CRA has a bad role, its role in recent events has been overblown. Well, I think it still made a lot of damage. After all, he says it was on the books for decades before the bubble began. The law's worst legacy is the permanent network of affordable housing advocates that sprang after it passed. These groups, which were intended to facilitate lending in poor areas, continually called for increased availability by banks and additional government support for affordable housing initiatives. The CRA also helped create a climate to which lending to low-income households was a key metric and condition regulators use in proving the bank mergers. And I believe in Missoula we have we have maybe one or two other nonprofit groups that gets government grants to support these ideas. Older, more decent developments played a bigger role in the financial crisis. In 1993, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston published Closing the Gap, a guide to equal opportunity lending. The report recommended a series of measures to better serve low-income and minority households. Most of the recommendations were routine and mundane. Better staff training improved outreach and communication, and the like. But the report also urged banks to loosen their income thresholds for receiving a mortgage. In the years after the report was published, activists and officials, especially in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, under both President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush, used its findings to pressure banks to increase their lending to low-income households. By the turn of the century, other changes in federal policy made those demands more achievable. If you can't lend money if you don't have it, and beginning in 2001, the Federal Reserve made sure lots of people had it. In January 2001, when President Bush took office, the federal funds rate, the key benchmark for all interest rates in the economy, or in this country, was 6.5%. Then, in response to the meltdown in the technology sector, the Fed began cutting the rate. By August 2001, it was at 3.75%. And after the terrorist attacks of September 11, the Fed opened the spigot, and by the summer of 2002, the federal funds rate was 1%. The central bank's efforts went so far that at one point in 2003, we had interest rates below the rate of inflation, or effectively negative. Institutional investors looking at low yields on Treasury securities needed a place to park money and earn some kind of return. Mortgage-backed securities became a favorite investment vehicle. Under traditional models, they were safe, and because of Fed policy, even the most conservative fund could earn better returns than they could on Treasury notes. Investment houses would bundle individual mortgages from several banks together into bond-like products that they would sell to individual investors. Mortgages historically have been seen as among the safest investments, and the era of rising house values transformed safe into guaranteed returns. For the first half of the decade, trading in mortgage-backed securities exploded. The growth provided unprecedented levels of capital in the mortgage market. And at the same time, investment houses were looking to replace the healthy fees earned during the dot-com bubble. Mortgage-backed securities had fat margins, so everyone jumped into the game, including all those fat cats on Wall Street. The additional capital to underwrite mortgages was a good thing, up to a point. Home ownership expanded throughout most of the Bush's presidency. During the last few decades, the American home ownership rates has been around 60% of adult households. At the height of the bubble, it reached almost 70%. It is clear now that many people who got mortgages at the high water mark should not have, but Wall Street needed to feed the stream of mortgage-backed securities. So he goes on to talk about Freddie and Fannie, which are quasi-government agencies we'll ever set up anyway. It's hard to overstate the role Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac played in this creating this crisis, he said. Chartering by Congress, Fannie in 1938, Freddie in 1970, the two government-sponsored enterprises provided much of the liquidity for the nation's housing market because their investors believed, correctly he says, it turns out, that Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac were backed by an explicit guarantee from the federal government that the companies were able to raise money more cheaply than the competitors. They were also exempt from federal and state and local taxes. The chief mission of Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac was to buy up mortgages issued by banks, freeing up bank money for additional mortgages. Freddie and Fannie would package these mortgages into mortgage-backed securities and sell them on the secondary mortgage market, providing cash to continue the cycle. Even when selling those securities, they often retain the full risk for any default, pocketing a portion of the interest payments in return. Fannie and Freddie would also keep a portion of these mortgages in their own investment portfolios, providing a constant influx of personal payments. Starting in the 1990s, they increasingly created and traded in complex derivatives, financial instruments designed to insulate them from hedging from mortgage loan defaults and other interest rate increases. From the mid-90s through the early 2000s, Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac were the darlings of Wall Street with steadily earnings growth and solid credit ratings. Fannie's share price peaked in 2001, almost 400% above its 1995 level. Freddie peaked in 2004, almost 500% higher than its 1995 excuse me, this growth would not last. Of course, in June of 2003, Freddie Mac surprised Washington and Wall Street with a management shakeup. The top executives were sent packing, and a new auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, identified several accounting irregularities on the company's books, especially related to its portfolio of derivatives. The company would have to restate earnings for the previous several years. Just days before the agency responsible for regulating Freddie, the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight, had reported to Congress that the company's management effectively conveys an appropriate message of integrity and ethical values. Just how wrong this assessment was would soon become abundantly clear. And there you have the wolf watching the chicken coop. As the extent of the accounting irregularities emerged, federal regulators descended on company and quickly determined that the accounting troubles extended to Fannie Mae as well. With concerns about the companies growing, the Bush administration unveiled proposals to rein them in. Then Secretary of Treasury John Snow proposed putting Fannie and Freddie under his department's oversight and subjecting them to the kind of controls over risk and capital reserves that apply to commercial banks. Fannie's debt-to-capital ratio was 30-1, whereas conventional banks have a debt-to-capital ratio of around 11-1. But Fannie and Freddie by this point were political powerhouses. When the accounting scandal first emerged, Fannie's chairman was Franklin Raines, former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Bill Clinton. His vice chairman was Jamie Gorelick, a former Justice Department official who had served on the 9/11 Commission. The two companies have provided tens of millions of dollars in annual campaign contributions and spent more than $10 million a year combined on Hollywood lobbyists. And of course, even our members of Congress got donations from the two mortgage giants. Fannie and Freddie rallied their friends on Capitol Hill, who immediately pushed back against the Bush proposals. Representative Barney Frank, the Democrat from Massachusetts, the ranking Democrat on the House Financial Services Committee, said these two entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are not facing any kind of financial crisis. The more people exaggerate these problems, the more pressure there is on these companies, less we will see in terms of affordable housing. The reform effort fizzled. Of course, in 2006, the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight issued the blistering results of this investigation. The irregularities investigators concluded amount to extensive financial fraud. The purpose of the deception was clear. They said to smooth earnings from year to year in order to maintain increasing returns and maximize executive bonuses. Raines, for example, earned more than $50 million in bonuses tied to earnings during his 6-year tenure. And remind you, Raines was one of Obama's staff people. Interestingly, the report noted two questionable transactions Fannie conducted with the investment bank Goldman Sachs in 2001-2002 that pushed more than $100 million of existing profits into the future, creating a kind of cushion for future earnings. The chairman of Goldman Sachs, when the dodgy transactions took place, was the man behind the 2008 bailout, of course, Treasury Secretary Shifty Henry Paulson. In the end, Fannie and Freddie had to restate more than $15 billion in earnings. The Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight and the Securities and Exchange Commission fined Fannie $400 million and Freddie $125 million. And there was a new push for tighter oversight on the Hill, but this too was withered as Fannie and Freddie rallied support through increased lending to low-income borrowers. Then Freddie and Fannie went on a subprime bender. The companies made it clear they wanted to buy up all the subprime mortgages and the Alt-A mortgages, whose risk is somewhere between prime and subprime, that they could find. They eventually acquired around $1 trillion of the paper, and the market responded. In 2003, less than 8% of all mortgages were subprime. By 2006, the number was more than 20%. Banks knew they could sell subprime products to Fannie and Freddie. Investment banks realized that if they placed ever-increasing amounts of subprime mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, they could add slightly higher levels of risk, and as a result, boost the returns and earn higher fees. The ratings agencies, thinking that they were simply dealing with traditional appreciated mortgages, didn't look under the hood. And of course, most of those things, if they were done legally, would have been backed by other securities or money in the bank to take care of those things, insurance-wise. But since they were bundled in a separate way, there was no insurance, so when they went under, well, there's no assets to back them up. But after several years of the housing boom, the pool of households that could responsibly use the more exotic financing products had dried up. Essentially, there were no more people who qualified for even a subprime mortgage. And he goes on to say everything worked as long as the housing prices continued to rise. Suddenly, though, there weren't enough buyers. At the same time, the first wave of more exotic mortgages began to falter. Interest rates on adjustable rate mortgages moved higher, and the Fed was finally constricting the money flow, with the federal funds rate peaking at 5.2%. In July 2006, mortgages that were initially increasingly were close to resetting, with monthly payments jumping to include principal. A significant number of these mortgages moved into default and foreclosure, which further dampened housing prices. The overall foreclosure numbers were small. Someone simply looking at housing statistics could be forgiven for wondering if all the fuss was all about. Nationally, throughout 2007 and 2008, the number of mortgages moving into foreclosure was only about 1 to 2%, suggesting that 98% to 99% of mortgages are sound. But the foreclosed mortgages punched away the above weight class. They were laced throughout the mortgage-backed securities owned by most financial institutions. The complexity of these financial products could not be overstated. They usually had 2 or 3 trenches, different baskets of mortgages that paid out in different ways. Worse, he says, as different firms brought and sold them, they were sliced and diced in various ways. A mortgage-backed security owned by one company could be very different when it was sold to another. No one fully realized how exposed the mortgage-backed securities were to the rising foreclosures. Because of this uncertainty, it was hard to place a value on them, and the market for instruments dried up. Accounting regulations required firms to buy their assets using the mark-to-market rule, i.e., based on the price they could fetch that very day. Because no one was trading mortgage-backed securities anymore, most had to be marked at something close to zero. Well, the mark-to-market, I think, is nothing more than what a buyer and seller will agree upon. You might have a car that might be worth $2,000, but if only somebody will pay $500 for the car, then it's not worth $2,000. It's only worth $500 because that's all you can get for it. And he says this threw off banks' capital loan ratios. The law requires banks to hold assets equal to a certain percentage of loans that they give out. Lots of financial institutions had mortgage-backed securities on their books. With the value of these securities moving to zero, or at least in accounting terms, banks didn't have enough capital on hand for the loans that were outstanding. So the banks rushed to raise money, which raised self-fulfilling fears about their solvency. 2 simple regulatory tweaks could have prevented much of the carnage. Suspending mark-to-market accounting rules, using a 5-year rolling average valuation instead, for example, he notes, would have helped shore up the balance sheets of some banks. And a temporary easing of capital requirements would have given banks the breathing room to sort out the mortgage-backed security mess. Although it is hard to fix an exact piece or price for the securities on this market, given that 98% of the underlying mortgages are sound, they clearly weren't worth zero. At last, the Fed and the Treasury Department, in full crisis mode, decided to provide their own capital to meet the regulatory requirements. The first misstep in March was to force a hostile takeover of Bear Stearns, putting up $30 billion to $40 billion to back J.P. Morgan's purchase of the distressed investment bank. That would have set in motion legal proceedings that would have established a baseline for the mortgage-backed securities. From this established price, banks should have begun to sort out their balance sheets. Immediately after the collapse of Bear Stearns, rumors circulated on Wall Street of trouble at another investment bank, Lehman Brothers. Lehman went on a PR offensive to beat back those rumors. The company was successful in the short term, but then did nothing during the next several months to shore up its balance sheets. Its demise in September, the only major bankruptcy allowed during the bailout season, was largely self-inflicted. The collapse of mortgage-backed security market now started to pollute other financial products. And it says collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps are complicated financial products intended to help spread the risk of defaults. An investor holding a bond or mortgage-backed security may purchase one of those products so that in the event the bond or mortgage-backed security defaults, they would recoup their investment. Bonds rarely default, so collateralized debt obligations and debt credit default swaps have traditionally been a fairly safe and conservative market. But like the underlying bonds and mortgage-backed securities, these investments became more exotic. Companies sold credit default swaps on an individual bond or security to multiple investors. If there was a default, each one of those investors would have had to paid up the full amount of the bond or security. Imagine if you brought a fire insurance on your home and all your neighbors did too. If your house burned, everyone would be compensated for the loss of your house. Suddenly, stable firms such as AIG, which aggressively sold credit default swaps, were overexposed. These developments threw off the accounting in one division of AIG, threatening the rest of the firm. Given a few days, AIG would have sold enough assets to cover the spread, but ironclad accounting regulations precluded this, so the government stepped in. The 1-2 punch of Lehman's failure and the government's $85 billion bailout of AG on September 16th shocked both Wall Street and the White House. With Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac already in government receivership, there were fears that the weaknesses stemming from the mortgage-backed securities would spread through the entire financial system. Money began leaving the markets to seek the security of Treasury bonds. Then on September 18th, it was reported that the Reserve Primary Fund and the Reserve International Liquidity Fund, two commercial paper money market funds, broke the buck, meaning they lost money. The commercial paper market is supposed to be boring. Everyday companies around the world borrow hundreds of millions to smooth cash flows. The next day they pay it back, giving the bank that lent the money a very small return. When these money market funds lost money, it was a signal to the commercial paper market was drying up. Then the banks were hesitant to make even those very safe returns. That's when the market freaked out, he said. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 600 points on September. When the government announced that there would be a rescue plan, the market temporarily rebounded, and after some details of the plan emerged over the weekend, the Dow had another sell-off. A roller coaster of sell-offs and rallies followed as the market waited to see when the government would do, or what the government would do. Every gyration up and down was used as an argument for the bailout. If the market moved lower, it was because Congress hadn't approved the bailout. If it moved higher, it was because the market was convinced the bailout would happen. Then on October 2nd, after initially defeating the package, the House of Representatives bowed to pressure and passed it. Well, they had a lot of pressure too, but there was a lot of pork in the bill that they'd previously passed, sent to the Senate. The Senate tacked on the bailout bill and sent it back to the House, and so they had a lot of pork to get home to voters for this election year. The Incumbent Protection Act was working just fine back then. The original plan was crafted by the Treasury Department that would have authorized the government to spend up to $700 billion on mortgage-backed securities and other toxic debt, thereby removing them from banks' balance sheets. With the bad loans off the books, the banks would become sound because it was assumed that the mortgage-backed security market was liquided and the government would become the buyer of last resort for these projects. There was a certain simple elegance to this plan, and to paraphrase H.L. Mencken, the situation was neat, feasible, or plausible, and wrong. They talk about the market is truly liquided. Last summer, Merrill Lynch unloaded a bunch of bad debt at 22 cents on the dollar. There are plenty there are likely plenty of buyers for the bank's toxic debt, but not at the price the banks would prefer. Into the government, which clearly intended to purchase mortgage-backed securities at some minimum above the market price. We don't know yet what the premium will be, nor how it will be determined. Well, in a sense, we do. It will be mostly be determined by politics and not economics. This is a foundational flaw in the Treasury Department's plan. The department has begun to process a process to determine the assets it will buy and the manner in a manner it will set a price. As with everything in government, there are lobbyable moments, a time when swarms of financial service investor groups from housing advocates try to game the system for their clients or members. The further away from economics these decisions are made, the more risk there is for the taxpayers. The higher the premium over the content market price, the longer the government will have to hold the assets, and the more exposure there will be for taxpayers, probably in the form of higher taxes. The risk here is particularly high given the complicated and opaque nature of the financial instruments involved. Few on Wall Street truly understand these products, and the bailout authorizes the Secretary Department to bypass normal contracting rules and hire outside private firms to handle the purchases and mortgage and manage the toxic assets. The fact that these private firms have ongoing relationships with the bank selling these bad assets results in serious conflicts of interest. And we noted before that Henry Paulson used to be CEO of Goldman Sachs, so there's one conflict of interest right there. Some commentators have drawn parallels to the savings and loan bailout in the 1980s when the government established the Resolution Trust Corporation to dispose of assets of failed thrifts. But the Resolution Trust Corporations took on those assets only as thrifts went bankrupt. Under the new plan, by contrast, federal bureaucrats and their outside contractors decide which assets to buy, including equity stakes in commercial banks that aren't particularly happy about having Uncle Sam as a major shareholder. So I guess we are simply socializing in these institutions. Bureaucrats will be actively investing taxpayer funds in individual securities and then managing the portfolio until they decide to sell. You don't have to be paranoid to fear the political dynamics that will shape these decisions. And of course, we have crossed a financial Rubicon. The bailout is just beginning of Washington's increased involvement in the economy, and the government has taken partial ownership of the nation's 9 largest banks. And there is talk of bailouts for other weak industries, including the car makers and the airlines. There certainly will be a host of new regulations that will likely be with us as long after the government has sold off the last of the bad debt. We could be coming into an era when the financial services sector evolves into a kind of regulated utility. Of course, libertarians used to joke that we were on the verge of another return of the 70s show with the return of old regulations and high taxation. We should be so lurky. The events of the last 7 months pressure return to the 30s with the new surge of federal or direct federal involvement in the economy. So if we fail to beat back these government controls, future historians may mark this time as the beginning of a long winter of statism and stagnation. Well, more socialism to the fact. But we're out of time anyway for this edition of Other People's Pockets. I'm Mike Bellows. We'll see you next time. Catch us on the web at www.lp.org. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching.